I'm going to show you the same pictures from the same satellite that look different. This is Christmas on stereo A, and this is 17 nanometers, otherwise known as 171 angstroms. Notice that flashing. Notice the dark corona inside and then the lighter corona on the outside. Notice the flashing. Doesn't seem to be located in just one area of the sun. It seems to be a solar-wide phenomenon. Switch now to the actual stereo A website. We pulled down 1,100 images, strung them together, and running them by you quickly right now, 0.1 seconds per frame, so that you can get a streaming video of roughly the same sun taken from the same satellite and the same wavelength on the same day. And you notice there's a slight difference. There's a difference. So why would there be a difference in the frame, in the framing? Why would there be a difference in the lighting? You know, how do you account for such a difference if it's in fact the same video from the same satellite on the same day in the same wavelength? But you can see the dark cavities there that are not prevalent on the other one. And you can see the cropping is different. Here you see a cropping frame that looks more like an 8-sided figure. Go figure. When we look at the electron simulations, we see electrons coming in. And we get more electrons with coronal hole streams. And notice the tail stream of the Earth is cut off. And is it because it's going in a different direction? Is the tail stream being pulled away from you or pushed towards you so that you no longer looks like it's going from right to left? I don't know. And I honestly believe that this instrument has been smoothed out, that they've lowered the sensitivity on it. Because there's just been some very strange things happening on this instrument. It used to become totally awash in electrons, and constantly, and then all of a sudden the electrons went away. So I know this brown dwarf didn't decide to turn around and go back out the opposite way. It's got to complete an orbit around the sun. This brown dwarf people call Planet X. The influx of electrons is interesting because there are hardly any protons associated. Protons and electrons are ejected out coronal holes and in the coronal hole streams in equal ratios. Why? Because that's where the electron came from. It came from the proton. But then why don't we see protons? And that's because there's so much helium-3 in the corona and in the solar system that it wants another proton to become helium-4. And so it's gobbling up those protons. This is the only magnetogram you can even get anymore. I told you that when I started showing you those that they were going to go away, and I hate being right every single time. Just once, I wish I would be wrong. But on the south pole of the sun, you see some red closed field lines. Those aren't supposed to be there. It's supposed to be an open field line. And so when you get a red closed field line over the south pole, then the coronal hole stream has to punch through those loops. And in doing so, creates particle collisions. Those particle collisions then cause a chain reaction that's explosive and similar to the fission in a nuclear bomb. So the other thing is the green closed field lines. They call them helmet streamers, and they get kind of pointed every time there's a coronal hole that blows through them. It makes them kind of pointed. And they light up under visible light. They call them helmet streamers. But look at how those two engulf from time to time and go underneath the south pole of the sun. Helmet streamers are supposed to be created by active regions. But yet we've had a real strong signature of those green closed field lines now for months without any sunspots whatsoever. So what's creating the closed field lines? It almost looks like it's the North Pole and the South Pole and not an active region. Those helmet streamers seem to envelop and connect the North with the South. So that would explain why there's such activity in this southern hemisphere or the south pole of the sun. When those particles come from that explosive fission, you don't see a change in density in front of the Earth off to the right, but here you see a drastic change in density from green to orange or yellow. There's actually a gap there, several hours gap. That happens every day now. They cut out 4 to 8 hours in this simulation. The particles coming from the sun come in from right to left, and when there's something that messes with the magnetic field lines, generally you can see a density increase on the right-hand side of the simulation, and that's what we just showed you, a change in color. So many times we see particles come through and without any density changes whatsoever on the right-hand side of the Earth, the right-hand side of the simulation. But you can see particles come washing through, and sometimes there's reflected a density change, like right now, coming from the right-hand side, which usually is a coronal hole stream. Well, so what we're getting then in our coronal hole streams is 90% helium and electrons. The helium, as well as protons, if there's any left, compress the magnetosphere. But the electrons seem to expand the magnetosphere because electrons repel one another. So when you have something that compresses the magnetosphere running at the same time through our magnetosphere with electrons, you get these huge fluxes in the magnetosphere distance and the standoff distance from our Earth. Energy is then created by the electrons, and look at inside the geosynchronous orbit of that dotted line. That white dotted line is about 5-6 Earth radii, and you see many times a lot of energy being produced underneath the orbit of those satellites. And again, those are electrons. Anytime you do anything with an electron, you change its speed, you change its valence level, you change its direction, it gives off X-rays, ultraviolet, and sometimes gamma radiation when it runs into a photon from the sun. So that's a lot of radiation, actually being produced inside that black circle in the middle. That glowing light blue disappears behind that black occulting disk. And so when we look down on the solar system, just try to see if there's a directional component, because we're looking for a brown dwarf that's behind your right shoulder right now, and the wind coming directly at the simulation. And we do see a little bit of vector changes, or those arrows changing direction, but they swirl. They're spinning like a compass spins. And finally, we see some density changes in front of the sun that can account for that kind of behavior in the tailstream. But what had been so mysterious is that for the last 6 months, the tailstream shows anomalies and sudden changes, but there's never a density change in front of the Earth. The sun is off to the right, so anything coming from the sun should create a density change, and that's what we're seeing. A coronal hole stream hitting Earth, devoid of protons, filled with electrons, which get here ahead of the helium. So you get this fluxing in the magnetosphere. Sometimes that lends itself to increased seismicity. Did we have any earthquakes in the last 4 or 5 days? I haven't checked, so you might want to see if there's been any increase in the number and magnitudes. The blue lines that are running vertically are interplanetary magnetic field set up by the flow of electrons. Those interplanetary magnetic fields, if you were to turn and look at them flat, they would look like a fan or a prop that spins. Obeying the right-hand rule. But when you see these things break off and go in different directions, it's either an indication of a wind speed that's going in a different direction or a magnetic influence from somewhere else. And that's what we're seeing, a magnetic influence from somewhere else. And so as I run through these simulations again, I just want you to pay attention to how much light blue energy is created underneath the satellites. I want you to pay attention to the actual harmonic vibrations of the magnetosphere, because when you get that in and out, back and forth fluxing, that's when people report hearing very strange sounds in the sky. Almost every time you get a nice systematic harmonic vibration in the magnetosphere, those sounds are being recorded somewhere. And that's a lot of energy being created around the Earth. It's low level, but there's a lot of it, and it's always there. Some of it's actually inside our magnetic bands, our magnetic disks, our electron belts. They're being produced inside. Why? Because the electrons repel one another. So that's why you have that cleaving at the back of the tail stream. Those electrons are coming around the Earth in two different directions and run into each other, and then you see that looks like a little dimple in the magnetic field. So now we're seeing stuff come through our tail stream with some density changes in front of the Earth. We're looking down on the Earth now, and we're seeing some directional changes, because when the two sources of electrons hit each other, they still want to be pulled into the magnetic field lines, but they repel one another. So think about when two different streams of water hit each other, they create a little eddies. Well, finally we get a magnetogram that looks halfway normal. Again, there's like a tilt to the sun. We don't see any magnetic field lines coming out of the north. Again, the north magnetic field lines appear to be wrapping back around and attaching to the edges of the southern coronal hole, unless, of course, there's an equatorial coronal hole or an equatorial active region. And I just wanted to go through this. Notice those little lines and mosaics created by these X-rays. These are a couple Class X flares that were released during the very end of our solar maximum, and we ended solar max with a boom. But you can see some systematic, very symmetrical patterns being created in that magnetic field along the lines of X-ray emissions. We look at this is GOES, G-O-E-S satellite, I do believe, and notice the orange line is density and the purple line is speed, and notice we see almost an increase dot per dot of speed with an increase in density. Now, for years and decades, anytime there was increased densities, the particles would slow down. So when you have an increase in density and an increase in speed, that does not run opposite of one another, but runs quite proportionate to one another, that's usually a good sign that we're picking up a second source of particles. And last but not least, we just wanted to tell you, Todd's not putting any new music up here. He's going to be composing a bunch of new music for the Patreon site, because we feel YouTube is really a lame platform anymore, filled with a lot of pretend news. I don't want to call it fake. I want to call it pretend. People are pretending to be journalists, but very few people are doing their own research. A lot of people are restating other people's research. 90% of the videos out there are repostings of other videos. And that's what we got in trouble for. Only they said they don't have any idea which videos it is that got us in trouble. They won't identify them. Our community guidelines are in good standing. Our copyrights are in good standing. So if we upload something that's not fair use, it doesn't fall within fair use, that we didn't get permission on, I'd sure like to know which videos they are referring to.